Going Down Fighting by LeilahMoon. Read by Ella Mabella. Chapter 19. "I'm not really sure about this," Hermione protested as Ginny fussed around her. "You look beautiful," the redhead chided, swatting her friend's hand away from attempting to touch her hair. Much to Ginny's chagrin, Hermione had refused to go dress shopping for their graduation ceremony until nude grades arrived, convinced that it would be bad luck to tempt fate in such a way. Fortunately, she had achieved an outstanding in every subject, and they had ventured into Hogsmeade immediately. Now, as Ginny attempted to soothe her concerns, Hermione was fretting about the dress she had chosen in a moment of nostalgia for the Jewel Ball. It was floor-length, periwinkle blue satin gown with a fitted V-neck bodice, supported by spaghetti straps that crisscrossed across an open back. "It's too low-cut," she moaned. "Why did I let you persuade me? This was a good idea." "Because it looks amazing," Ginny retorted, taking a step back to admire her work. "Now stop whining. Malfoy's already waiting for you downstairs." Hermione's look of confusion was ignored. "He's early. The ceremony doesn't start for—" Ginny gestured towards the door and pushed her out. As she walked into the common room, Draco stood quickly, his eyes roaming languidly up and down. "Merlin," he breathed, "you're perfect." Hermione flushed and offered her own appreciative gaze. He wore a crisply pressed suit that was such a deep emerald green it matched the black shirt and tie impeccably. "You're not so bad yourself, Malfoy," she replied, aware this was a complete understatement. "Just for you, Granger," he drawled, then straightened up. "Right, before we head to the Great Hall, I've got something to show you." She glared at him suspiciously. He looked far too pleased with himself for this to be a surprise she would enjoy. "I swear to Salazar, if you've sabotaged another one of my decorations because you decided they didn't go with your outfit—" Draco smirked and grabbed her hand, steering her out into the corridor and towards the staircase. "Oh, how you wound me with these accusations!" They eventually rounded a corner near the library, and Hermione slowed as two adults came into view. The couple wore muggle clothing, but glancing at Draco, he didn't seem to have taken any notice. As they got closer, her heart began to flutter. Hermione stopped abruptly. Her knees buckled. It couldn't be. Hermione turned wide-eyed to Draco, who, watching carefully, nudged her gently forward. "What?" A painfully familiar voice called out her name as though it were a question, and that was all Hermione needed to hear. She stumbled slightly, righted herself, and flew down the corridor, her footsteps ricocheting loudly off the stone walls. Jean Granger threw her arms around Hermione as Richard gripped her shoulders tightly. "Oh my God! Mum! Dad!" When the three of them pulled apart, she suddenly felt inexplicably nervous. Having never allowed herself the luxury of imagining this moment, Hermione wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Question after question pounded mercilessly against her brain, but all she could do was stare mutely at her parents. They looked at her as though they understood. "What? How are you here?" she spluttered eventually. Jean smiled at her before turning sharply to Draco. "You really told her absolutely nothing?" "I thought it would be a nice surprise," he offered, a faint blush creeping across his cheekbones. Hermione stared at Draco incredulously, and her expression grew almost comical as she watched her father pat him fondly on the shoulder. "Words of wisdom," he murmured. "Granger women tend not to appreciate surprises, particularly of this magnitude." Draco nodded solemnly. "Could someone please explain?" "Sweetheart," Jean said, looking aimlessly up and down the corridor. "I wonder whether we ought to be seated for this." Draco tipped his head towards an empty classroom and, upon entering, summoned 4 chairs for the group. Aware of the limited time available to them, Hermione had to be content with a brief overview until after graduation ceremony. Draco and her parents explained how, following the inter-house Quidditch match, Narcissa had approached Shacklebolt with a number of rare tomes on memory charms from the Malfoy Manor library. The minister agreed that Patrick could study the books and make use of any information he deemed safe. As a result, the work with her parents intensified to a point where they were left constantly drained and exhausted. However, as fragments of their memory were finally beginning to return, they carried on, desperate to remember more of their daughter. "Once it became clear that we were nearing the end of our treatment, but not entirely ready to see you again, Hermione, Patrick thought we should come back to England and spend time with someone who knows you well." Richard nodded in Draco's direction. So we've been staying at the manor for the last 10 days, Jean said, continuing the narrative. Draco has been popping in when he can to fill any gaps we've been missing. A pensive silence swirled around them before Hermione asked quietly, Are you angry with me? We were, her mother stated, when we first found out. Richard squeezed his wife's hand and continued for her. But after we spoke with Nurse and Draco here, we understood. It took us a while, but we did. Hot tears had begun trailing down Hermione's cheeks as her parents spoke. Draco gently ran his thumb across her wet skin. I'm so sorry, she choked. It was the hardest decision of my life. I wanted to keep you safe. Richard smiled sadly. We know, love. We just wish you would have spoken to us first. There might have been other options. A pulse of light and the quiet chime of a bell interrupted their conversation. Draco apologized, explaining that he had used his wand as an alarm. We've got to get going, Hermione. She looked tentatively at her parents. You're staying, aren't you? Of course we are, Jean replied, pulling her daughter close. We'll be at the front. The four of them left the classroom and made their way towards the Great Hall. Hermione was in the middle of providing yet another fact about the castle when two boys raced towards them. Merlin, Ron gasped, leaning heavily on his knees. We've been looking everywhere for you. McGonagall's in a flat, wondering what's happened to you both, Harry added, glancing briefly at the two extra adults present. Hermione checked the time and frowned. We're not late. What? You're always early. Of course she's going to be worried about her favorite pupil. She rolled her eyes at Ron, who had begun herding them down the corridor. Just come on. She's going to have an aneurysm at this rate. Chapter 20. There you are, Professor McGonagall said sharply, handing out small piles of black material. Come on, quickly now. Waving goodbye to her parents, Harry and Ron, Hermione apologized to the headmistress and grasped Draco's hand to pull him in line with the other 7th and 8th years waiting to graduate. The rest of the school were already seated for their arrival, and many stared open-mouthed as they entered the great hall, whispers reverberating off the walls. Draco shot a scowl in Hermione's direction. I told you we would look ridiculous, he muttered. She laughed quietly at his petulant look, too pleased with her achievement to pay him much attention. It had taken a significant amount of convincing, but Hermione had managed to persuade her peers to do Muggle graduation caps. They had already made great progress in the encouragement of inter-house unity, and she hoped the school would continue promoting an acceptance of difference, particularly if it helped Muggle-born witches and wizards feel more comfortable entering the magical world. The ceremony was set up in such a way that it ran in almost direct juxtaposition to their arrival in the Great Hall 8 years ago. This time, rather than being filled with trepidation as they awkwardly shuffled into the impressive space, they instead walked confidently towards the headmistress, ready to leave the castle and begin their lives outside of Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall summoned each graduate one by one to the front of the hall, and although she no longer needed to use her long roll of parchment, persisted in calling them surname first, a small reminder of their experience with the Sorting Hat. Eventually, she read out, Granger Hermione. Heart pounding with anticipation, Hermione glanced over her shoulder to find her parents in the front row before slowly making her way forward. Professor McGonagall held out her hand for her to shake, but forgetting herself in a sudden swell of emotion, Hermione ignored it and wrapped her arms around the older witch's neck. She realized her mistake when McGonagall gave her a gentle pat on the back, and she stepped away in a haze of embarrassment. Hermione, the headmistress smiled, eyes shining slightly. It's been a pleasure getting to know you over the last 8 years, and a privilege to see you grow in confidence, both personally and academically. Hermione felt her own eyes begin to burn. You will be sorely missed, but I'm looking forward to seeing what you achieve in the future. Thank you, Professor, she choked. I can't begin to tell you how much that means coming from you. I'll never forget everything you've done for us all over the years. Don't be a stranger, and please do visit us whenever you like. Hermione dipped her head and walked quickly away, hoping to avoid the onslaught of tears that were threatening to overwhelm her. She came to a standstill at the front of the Great Hall, surrounded by peers whose name had already been called. When it was Draco's turn, Professor McGonagall handed him a small white envelope and murmured something with a kind look on her face. Walking away, he grinned and flashed Hermione a glimpse of the red wax seal emblazoned with an M. Draco, she breathed as he reached her. Is that what I think it is? He nodded, eyes bright. There are no concerns regarding my probation period. I've passed with flying colors. Hermione struggled to quell the excitement bubbling inside her. It's all over, Granger. And they're considering reducing the term of my mother's house arrest. I'm so happy for you. She beamed, trying to keep her voice low. Draco pulled her close, and they focused back on the headmistress as she continued working her way through the students. It didn't take long before Pansy, Ginny, and Blaise came to join them. Professor McGonagall's voice resonated suddenly around the hall. And now we say goodbye to our class of 1999. We remember that every end has a new beginning. Good luck to you all. The sound of raucous applause and stamping feet filled the room in response, and the headmistress gestured for the 7th and 8th years to begin exiting the castle. Hermione gripped Draco's hand as they headed towards the doors, linking arms with Ginny on her other side. Neville and the others followed closely behind, whilst their friends and family were going to walk into Hogsmeade, ready to apparate onwards. The graduates would meet them there, following a boat ride across the Black Lake. There was little conversation held as the group walked, each lost to their own ruminations. Only the quiet crunch of footsteps upon grass filled the silence. As they approached the lake, Hermione eyed the small wooden vessels, each bobbing quietly, and another wave of nostalgia washed over her like the water lapping at the shore. She readied herself to complete the circle and make the return journey to that of her 11-year-old self. Stepping carefully over the threshold, Hermione and Draco sat facing backward, committing the sharp outline of Hogwarts to memory as the boat drew them away. She smiled to herself as she reflected on some of her experiences within those castle walls, still not quite believing that it was the end of her time there. She noticed a few members of staff walk down the stone steps and stand before the great oak doors, watching their students float gradually away. Despite the fading light, she could just make out Hagrid's wayward beard and Professor McGonagall's pointed head. The latter raised her wand and shot a burst of silver light into the darkening sky. Hermione gasped as it transformed into a spectacular firework display. Resting her head on Draco's shoulder, she waited until the last spark flickered out and finally felt ready to say goodbye. The end. Thank you for listening to Going Down Fighting by LeilahMoon, read by Ella Mabella. If you have enjoyed this story, please consider following me on YouTube, Spotify, AO3, Instagram, or Tumblr to stay up to date on upcoming stories.